There is a moment, just before sleep, when the world loosens its grip. The weight of the day softens. Time stops asking anything from you. This is where reflection feels safest, where questions can exist without needing answers. Tonight is not about urgency. It is not about fear or prediction or the future pressing closer. It is about stillness and about looking gently at ourselves through something distant and quiet. As you settle into this final chapter, let the noise of interpretation fade. What remains is not a mystery to solve, but a mirror to observe. Throughout this series, we've examined 3I Atlas from multiple perspectives, as a signal moving silently through space, as a comparison to earlier objects that briefly captured human attention, as a reminder of ancient patterns, myths, and cyclical stories that have followed humanity across centuries. Each lens offered something different, not because the object changed, but because our way of looking did. If you feel drawn to this kind of slow reflection, you may want to subscribe, not as a commitment, but as a quiet way of returning whenever these questions surface again. Like familiar constellations, you don't need to memorize to recognize. But when we step back far enough, when the urgency dissolves and the noise settles, a different realization emerges. The most important thing about 3I Atlas may not be the object itself, its trajectory, its composition, or its classification. It may be the response it provoked, the speed with which attention gathered around it, the ease with which meaning was projected onto it, the comfort found in turning uncertainty into story. Objects pass through the sky constantly: rocks, ice, fragments of older systems, remnants of formations that predate Earth itself. Most are unnoticed. They arrive, they leave, and nothing in human life shifts because of them. What changes is not the sky, it is the observer. The moment attention locks on, the object becomes more than matter. It becomes a container for interpretation. In the modern world, this process is accelerated. Media cycles compress reflection into reaction. Social amplification turns curiosity into urgency, and urgency into narrative. A name, a number, a trajectory is enough to awaken ancient instincts. Pattern recognition begins immediately, not as a flaw, but as a feature of human cognition. We look for repetition because repetition once meant survival. And so, 3I Atlas entered not just our telescopes, but our collective imagination. It revived familiar questions. Are we safe? Have we seen this before? Does this mean something larger than itself? These questions say less about the object and more about the psychological space we inhabit when certainty feels thin. When the present feels unstable, the mind reaches backward, searching the archive of shared memory for reassurance or warning. This is where the distinction becomes important, between observation and interpretation, between data and meaning. 3I Atlas did not announce itself. It did not arrive with intention. It followed physics, not prophecy. Yet the human response followed a different law, one shaped by history, myth, and the inherited need to believe that the sky is speaking directly to us. As this final chapter unfolds, the focus shifts away from what 3I Atlas is and toward what it reflects, not as a threat, not as a message, but as evidence of how quickly attention reshapes reality. The object continues on its path, unchanged, indifferent, silent. What remains here is the echo of our reaction, lingering long after the object has passed beyond relevance. And in that echo, something familiar begins to take shape, inviting a deeper look at why we return to the same stories, again and again, whenever the unknown briefly crosses our field of view. That familiar shape in the echo is not accidental. It is ancient, rehearsed, and deeply human. Long before instruments measured trajectories or classified objects, the sky was a canvas for memory. Every unexpected movement overhead became a prompt, not for calculation, but for meaning. The heavens were stable. When something disrupted that stability, attention followed instinctively. This is why the stories repeat. Floods, warnings, resets, survivors chosen to carry memory forward. These narratives appear in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, not because a single event copied itself perfectly across time, but because the human mind returns to the same structures when facing uncertainty. When the present feels fragile, continuity is sought in story. Narrative becomes a way to hold the world together. Anthropologically, this pattern is well understood. Memory is not preserved only through facts. It is preserved through meaning. A story survives when it explains loss, frames survival, and offers coherence after disruption. Civilizations remembered floods not simply because water rose, but because something familiar was swept away and had to be reimagined. The details changed, the structure remained. When 3I Atlas appeared in public discourse, it slipped easily into this inherited framework, not because it fit the myths precisely, but because the myths were already waiting. The object became a placeholder, a modern surface onto which ancient anxieties could be projected. Not fear in the dramatic sense, but a quieter unease. The sense that stability is temporary, that certainty is fragile, that something unseen might arrive without warning. This does not mean these reactions are irrational. They are adaptive. Pattern seeking helped early humans anticipate danger, track seasons, and survive environmental change. The problem arises when pattern recognition accelerates faster than reflection, when amplification replaces observation, when the story forms before the understanding. In previous eras, these narratives unfolded slowly. Generations refined them. Symbols replaced specifics. The lesson endured even as the original event blurred into myth. Today, the cycle is compressed. Meaning is demanded immediately. Silence feels uncomfortable. Uncertainty feels like a failure rather than a condition. So when the object was cataloged, discussed, and shared, the response followed a predictable arc. Initial curiosity, rapid interpretation, polarization between dismissal and exaggeration, and finally, exhaustion. Attention moved on, leaving behind fragments of unfinished meaning, but the underlying structure remained intact, waiting for the next trigger. This is why the same themes resurface regardless of the object itself. It is not about comets, asteroids, or interstellar visitors. It is about the human relationship with uncertainty, about how quickly we turn to the past when the present resists explanation, about how memory prefers narrative over randomness. 3I Atlas did not revive these stories. It revealed how ready they already were, how easily they activate, how little prompting they require. The object functioned less as an anomaly and more as a diagnostic, a brief moment that showed how attention moves, how meaning is constructed, and how the human mind negotiates the unknown. As we move closer to the center of this reflection, the question shifts again, away from why the stories exist, and toward what this particular moment teaches us about certainty itself, and about the quiet instability that drives us to search the sky for reassurance. That quiet instability sits beneath much of modern confidence, rarely acknowledged but constantly shaping behavior. We live in an age defined by measurement, prediction, and control, yet the sense of permanence those tools promise is thinner than it appears. Systems feel solid until they don't. Assumptions hold until they fracture, and when something unfamiliar enters awareness, it exposes how provisional certainty really is. 3I Atlas arrived within this psychological landscape, not as a disruptor of physics, but as a reminder of scale. It highlighted how small the margin is between what we understand and what we assume. In theory, its presence was unremarkable. In practice, it unsettled something quieter, the belief that the unknown is already accounted for, that surprises belong to the past. This reaction reveals an important distinction. There is uncertainty rooted in ignorance, and uncertainty rooted in humility. The first demands answers immediately. The second allows space. Much of the tension surrounding objects like 3i Atlas comes from confusing these two states. When humility is mistaken for ignorance, silence feels threatening. When not knowing is framed as failure, speculation rushes in to fill the gap. Historically, moments like this have acted as mirrors. They show how cultures relate to knowledge, authority, and time. In eras where tradition guided understanding, anomalies reinforced myth. In eras where religion dominated, they reinforced belief. In eras where science holds authority, anomalies test confidence in models and institutions. The surface narrative changes. The underlying dynamic does not. What stands out in this case is how quickly the past was invoked. Ancient floods, cycles of collapse, lost civilizations, not as historical claims to be verified, but as symbolic anchors. These stories offer something modern language often struggles to provide: emotional coherence, a sense that instability has been faced before and endured. This does not mean the stories are literal templates for the present. It means they function as psychological tools. They organize fear. They transform randomness into sequence. They allow people to feel oriented when the environment feels ambiguous. In that sense, their persistence is not evidence of forgotten knowledge, but of enduring human needs. 3 Atlas, then, becomes less interesting as an astronomical subject and more revealing as a cultural moment. It shows how attention moves faster than understanding, how narratives assemble themselves before evidence settles, how quickly complexity is simplified into something emotionally manageable. The key realization is not that people overreacted or that curiosity went too far. It is that reaction itself follows a pattern as old as storytelling, a pattern shaped by survival, memory, and the discomfort of open-ended questions. The object did not challenge our science. It challenged our relationship with uncertainty. As this reflection deepens, the focus narrows further, not on the sky, and not even on the stories we tell about it, but on the fragile space between certainty and meaning, the place where confidence pauses, where questions linger, and where the real lesson of 3i Atlas quietly begins to form. That fragile space between certainty and meaning is where attention does its most revealing work. It is the moment before explanation settles, when the mind hovers between acceptance and interpretation. In that pause, values surface. Assumptions become visible. What we expect from the universe quietly exposes what we expect from ourselves. 3i Atlas did not arrive as a test of technology. Our instruments performed as designed. Data was gathered, categorized, contextualized. What followed afterward belonged to a different domain. It belonged to perception, to the way information is absorbed once it leaves charts and enters conversation, once it moves from specialists into the shared space of collective imagination. Here, the object stopped being neutral. It became symbolic, not because it demanded symbolism, but because humans rarely allow unfamiliar things to remain unnamed for long. Meaning rushes in where silence feels uncomfortable, and in a world accustomed to constant explanation, ambiguity feels like a gap that must be closed quickly. This is where the idea of lessons often becomes distorted. We assume that meaning must be intentional, that if something matters, it must be pointing toward an outcome. But some of the most instructive moments are unintentional. They teach not by design, but by reflection. They reveal habits rather than deliver messages. The real lesson of 3i Atlas does not live in ancient confirmation or future prediction. It lives in the speed of our response, in how quickly the present reached backward, in how instinctively uncertainty was framed through inherited narratives rather than patient observation. The object became a prompt, and the response followed a familiar script. This script is not a failure. It is a trace, evidence of continuity across time. The same impulse that once read intention into eclipses now searches archives of myth and memory. The language has changed. The platforms have changed. The impulse has not. We still look upward when the ground feels unstable. What makes this moment distinct is awareness. For perhaps the first time, the reaction itself is visible. We can watch it unfold in real time. We can observe how curiosity becomes narrative, how narrative becomes identity, and how identity resists revision once it settles. This visibility offers a quiet opportunity, not to correct the past, but to notice the present. 3i Atlas did not confirm ancient myths. It did not validate cycles of destruction. It did not announce a reset. What it did was reveal how fragile certainty feels, even in an age of information, and how quickly the past is summoned when the present refuses to feel stable. This realization shifts the perspective again, away from disappointment that nothing happened, away from relief that nothing changed, toward something subtler. The understanding that attention itself is the event, that meaning is not waiting in the sky but forming here, shaped by fear, hope, memory, and expectation. And in that understanding, a simple sentence begins to carry weight, not as a conclusion, but as an observation that lingers quietly, waiting to be felt rather than emphasized. The sky did not change. Our attention did. Our attention did, and that shift explains more than any orbital calculation ever could. Attention is not passive. It selects, amplifies, and assigns importance. When it moves collectively, it reshapes reality at the cultural level. What we notice becomes significant. What we ignore dissolves. In this way, attention functions as an invisible architect, quietly deciding which moments become markers in time. Every generation believes it is uniquely aware of its own fragility. That belief feels justified because the conditions always change, technologies accelerate, information multiplies, systems interlock more tightly. Yet beneath these changes, the emotional structure remains strikingly consistent. We still experience uncertainty as threat. We still interpret disruption as signal. We still search for meaning beyond ourselves when the ground feels unstable. This is why the sky remains such a powerful reference point. It is distant, vast, and largely indifferent to human concerns. When meaning is projected upward, it feels external, objective, almost sanctioned by scale itself. Looking to the sky creates the impression that answers arrive from beyond culture, beyond politics, beyond individual bias. It feels safer to believe that meaning descends rather than emerges. 3i Atlas briefly occupied this symbolic position, not because it earned it, but because we placed it there. For a moment, it became a shared reference point, a neutral object carrying disproportionate weight. People with opposing views projected entirely different conclusions onto the same data. Some saw warning, others saw nothing at all. Both reactions reveal more about expectation than evidence. This divergence is important. It shows that facts alone do not settle meaning. They require interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by context. When trust in systems feels eroded, ambiguity feels dangerous. When stability feels temporary, even neutral events are scanned for implication. The object itself remained unchanged. The interpretive environment did not. There is a quiet humility in recognizing this. It dissolves the need to declare winners between belief and skepticism. Instead, it reframes the moment as a study in perception, a chance to see how easily the human mind fills silence, how uncomfortable it is to sit with open questions, how quickly narrative becomes a substitute for patience. In older cultures, time softened these reactions. Stories unfolded slowly, shaped by repetition and ritual. Today, immediacy collapses reflection into reaction. Attention spikes, fragments, and moves on. What remains is often a residue of unresolved meaning, a sense that something almost happened, even when nothing did. This sensation is familiar because it mirrors internal experience. The feeling of standing at the edge of change without crossing it, of anticipating transformation that never arrives. These moments are psychologically powerful. They invite interpretation precisely because they resist resolution. 3I Atlas became one of these moments. Not a turning point, but a pause, a brief alignment of attention that exposed how much we want turning points to exist, how deeply we desire confirmation that history moves in clear chapters rather than overlapping layers. As this reflection continues, the focus widens again, not to the object, and not even to the reaction, but to the long arc they both inhabit, the repeating rhythm of expectation and release, the way each generation reenacts the same search, convinced it is new, unaware that the pattern itself is the inheritance. And in that inheritance, something quietly enduring waits to be acknowledged, not as a conclusion, but as a shared condition that links past observers to present ones, all standing beneath the same unchanged sky. That unchanged sky has witnessed this posture countless times before. Humans standing still, looking upward, sensing that something important might be revealed if attention is held long enough. What differs across eras is not the impulse, but the language used to describe it. Where one age spoke in omens, another speaks in data. Where one named gods, another names probabilities. The structure of meaning remains intact beneath the vocabulary. This continuity challenges a common assumption, that progress replaces older ways of understanding. In reality, it layers them. Scientific explanation does not erase symbolic thinking. It coexists with it. The mind is capable of holding equations and stories simultaneously, often without conflict. Trouble arises only when one is expected to silence the other. 3I Atlas existed precisely at this intersection, technically defined, mathematically predictable, and emotionally ambiguous. It offered no instruction, no revelation, no consequence. And yet it drew attention because it touched a question science alone does not answer. How do we feel about not being central, about the universe moving without regard for us, about events that occur whether or not they carry meaning? This discomfort is subtle. It rarely announces itself as fear. More often, it appears as interpretation, as the urge to connect dots, to situate the unfamiliar within something familiar. Myths once served this purpose openly. Today, they return disguised as analysis, speculation, or concern, framed as responsibility. The repetition of ancient themes is not a regression. It is a reminder that human psychology evolves slowly. Memory, especially collective memory, prefers shapes it already recognizes. Floods, resets, warnings, survivors. These are not predictions. They are metaphors for disruption and continuity. They describe the anxiety of change and the hope that something endures beyond it. When such metaphors resurface around a neutral object, they reveal their function clearly. They are not about the sky. They are about stability, about control, about the need to believe that change follows rules, even if those rules are harsh. Randomness is harder to live with than fate. 3I Atlas offered no fate. It passed through awareness without consequence, and in doing so, it quietly denied the expectation that something must happen. That denial can feel unsatisfying. It leaves no lesson neatly packaged, no resolution to point toward, only a mirror reflecting the search itself. This is why the moment lingered longer than its relevance. Attention remained even as information settled. Discussion continued even as novelty faded. The object had already moved on, but the reflection had not. What we were really observing was our own difficulty with closure. In this sense, the object performed its most meaningful role after it ceased to matter astronomically. It became a case study in how modern minds process uncertainty, how quickly silence is filled, how anticipation persists even when evidence offers none. As we move deeper into this final reflection, the emphasis shifts again, away from explanation and toward acceptance. Not acceptance of ignorance, but acceptance of scale, of limits, of the idea that not every moment is a message, and not every object is about us. In that acceptance, something steadier emerges, a quieter understanding that the universe does not need to announce itself to be meaningful, and that sometimes the most revealing events are those that leave nothing behind but the trace of our attention slowly returning to rest. That return to rest is subtle, almost imperceptible. Attention does not switch off suddenly. It drifts, it loosens its grip and settles back into the background of daily thought. Yet even as it fades, it leaves an impression, like a shape briefly pressed into water. Something was noticed, something was felt, and even if no conclusion was reached, the experience remains stored quietly within collective memory. This is how moments without outcomes still matter. They recalibrate expectation. They remind us gently that significance is not always paired with consequence. Modern culture often treats meaning as something proven by results. If nothing changed, then nothing mattered. But human experience has never worked that way. Some of the most formative realizations leave no external trace at all. 3I Atlas belongs to this category. It did not alter trajectories, policies, or beliefs in any measurable way, but it exposed a reflex, the reflex to search for signals during times of diffuse uncertainty, the reflex to connect present ambiguity with inherited narratives of warning and renewal. Recognizing this reflex does not require rejecting it. It simply asks for awareness. Awareness changes the texture of reaction. When we see ourselves reaching for the familiar story, the grip softens. The story can be held lightly rather than inhabited fully. This is where maturity in interpretation begins, not in certainty, but in restraint, not in explanation, but in proportion. There is something stabilizing in realizing that the universe does not revolve around moments of human attention. Objects move, systems evolve, processes unfold on scales far beyond individual lifetimes. The sky is not waiting to be interpreted. It is simply there, and that neutrality can feel either unsettling or comforting, depending on how it is approached. For many, it is the absence of message that feels most difficult. We are conditioned to expect meaning to arrive fully formed, preferably dramatic, preferably urgent. When nothing arrives, the mind invents what is missing. This is not deception, it is continuity. A mind shaped to survive uncertainty will always prefer story to silence. Yet silence has its own instruction. It teaches patience. It invites humility. It reframes the role of the observer not as the center, but as a participant. 3I Atlas offered this lesson quietly, without ceremony. It allowed the cycle of anticipation to complete itself without reward, and in doing so, revealed the cycle itself. This recognition does not diminish curiosity, it refines it. It shifts interest away from outcomes and toward processes, away from prediction and toward perception. Instead of asking what will happen next, a different question emerges. Why do we expect something to happen at all? This question lingers gently. It does not demand resolution. It simply widens the frame. It places 3I Atlas alongside countless other moments that briefly gathered attention and then dissolved back into the ordinary flow of time. None of them were endings. None of them were beginnings. They were pauses, and in those pauses, something essential is practiced. The ability to observe without immediately assigning destiny. The ability to let uncertainty exist without transforming it into urgency. The ability to stand beneath an unchanged sky and feel connected, not because it speaks to us, but because we are capable of listening without needing it to speak back. As this final chapter continues, that quiet capability becomes the true subject. Not the object that passed, but the awareness that remains after it is gone. That awareness, once noticed, does not disappear easily. It settles beneath future moments, subtly influencing how they are met. The next anomaly, the next headline, The next unfamiliar signal will arrive, and something in the mind will remember this pause. Remember that attention itself can be observed. Remember that not every moment asks to be elevated into meaning. This is how cycles begin to loosen, not through rejection of old stories, but through recognition of when and why they arise. When awareness is present, reaction slows. The familiar narrative still appears, but it no longer rushes to the center. It becomes one option among many, rather than the default path. In this way, 3i Atlas quietly completed its role, not as an event, but as a calibration. It adjusted the relationship between stimulus and interpretation, even if only slightly. It offered a chance to notice how easily the extraordinary is constructed from the ordinary when attention is primed for significance. There is no requirement to hold on to this realization. It does not need to become a belief or a framework. It simply exists as a reference point, a memory of stillness following anticipation, a reminder that meaning does not always announce itself through disruption. Sometimes it arrives through absence. This understanding carries a kind of relief. It releases the pressure to decode every unfamiliar moment. It allows curiosity to coexist with calm, interest without urgency, observation without projection. These are not small shifts. They change the emotional tone of how the world is encountered. When the sky is no longer treated as a messenger, it becomes what it has always been, a vast context rather than a commentary, a backdrop for human experience, not a script written for it. This does not diminish wonder, it deepens it. Wonder that does not require answers can remain open indefinitely. Every generation will continue to look upward. That impulse will not fade, but the way it is inhabited can change. Attention can be held with softness rather than tension, with curiosity rather than expectation, with presence rather than anticipation. 3i Atlas will eventually be replaced in memory by other names, other objects, other moments of collective focus. That is inevitable. What matters is not which object holds attention, but how attention is held, whether it tightens around fear or opens into reflection. As the narrative now widens beyond this specific moment, it begins to touch something more universal, the enduring pattern of human attention itself, how it rises, how it projects, how it releases, and how, in learning to watch that movement, we begin to understand that the most revealing stories are not written in the sky, but in the way we look at it. That way of looking is shaped long before any specific object appears. It is inherited, practiced, reinforced across generations. Children learn not only what to notice, but how to notice, by watching the reactions of those around them. Attention is trained socially. What elders treat as significant becomes encoded as meaningful long before it is examined. This is why moments like 3i Atlas resonate beyond their immediate context. They activate learned responses. They tap into a cultural memory that extends further back than recorded history. Long before language stabilized, long before writing preserved detail, humans learned that survival depended on reading signs, clouds, animals, seasons, movements in the sky. Attention was once a tool for staying alive. That origin still matters. Even now, when the threats are abstract and the systems complex, the nervous system responds as if something essential might be at stake. A deviation from the expected pattern triggers alertness. The body leans forward. The mind searches for explanation. This response is not outdated. It is deeply embedded. Understanding this reframes the reaction to 3i Atlas once again. It was not simply curiosity or speculation. It was a rehearsal of an ancient posture, the stance of readiness, the instinct to prepare for change before it announces itself. In this light, the reaction appears less like overinterpretation and more like continuity. Yet continuity does not require permanence. The same instincts that once ensured survival can be softened when the environment allows it. Awareness creates choice. The reflex still appears, but it does not have to dictate behavior. Attention can pause without disengaging. Curiosity can exist without urgency. This balance is delicate. Too much detachment dulls wonder. Too much intensity breeds anxiety. The middle ground is rare and valuable. It allows engagement without projection, presence without pressure. 3i Atlas briefly illuminated this possibility by doing very little at all. There is an irony here. The object mattered because it did not fulfill expectation. It passed without delivering meaning, and in that absence, meaning emerged indirectly, not about the universe, but about ourselves, about how quickly we elevate moments into symbols, about how uncomfortable we are with neutrality. Neutrality feels incomplete. It offers no narrative arc, no resolution, but it is often the most honest state. The universe does not organize itself around human anticipation. It unfolds according to processes indifferent to interpretation. Accepting this does not reduce human significance. It clarifies it. We are meaning-making beings living in a system that does not require meaning to function. That tension is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to understand. 3i Atlas did not create this condition. It simply made it visible for a moment, long enough to be noticed. As this reflection moves forward, the focus shifts from reaction to responsibility. Not responsibility to predict or prevent, but responsibility to observe with care, to recognize when inherited instincts are shaping interpretation, to hold attention gently, aware of its power. In doing so, the object recedes further into the background where it belongs. What remains in focus is the observer, the quiet, complex, story-making presence standing beneath a sky that continues unchanged, offering no answers and requiring none to remain vast and real. That observer, once brought into focus, becomes impossible to ignore. The realization settles slowly, not as an insight that demands action, but as a subtle reorientation. The question is no longer what the universe is doing, but how we position ourselves in relation to it. How much weight we place on moments, and how quickly we turn them into symbols of something larger than they are. This is where responsibility quietly enters the frame, not the kind that carries urgency or obligation, but the kind that comes with awareness. To know how attention works is to know how easily it can be guided, amplified, or distorted. In a world saturated with signals, choosing how to attend becomes an ethical act, even if it feels small. 3i Atlas revealed how quickly collective focus can be drawn toward uncertainty. It showed how easily questions escalate when shared at scale. This is not a criticism of curiosity. It is an observation about momentum. Attention gathers speed as it moves. Once in motion, it resists slowing down, even when the original stimulus no longer warrants intensity. Historically, this momentum was limited by distance and time. Stories traveled slowly. Interpretations were refined across generations. Today, interpretation often arrives fully formed, polished, and persuasive within moments. The space for quiet observation shrinks. Silence is interpreted as absence rather than patience. Yet silence has always been part of understanding. In older traditions, waiting was not passive. It was an active posture. Observation unfolded over seasons, not cycles of news. Meaning was allowed to sediment gradually, shaped by repetition rather than reaction. That pace is difficult to sustain now, but its value has not diminished. The moment surrounding 3i Atlas briefly reintroduced the question of pace. How fast should meaning move? How quickly should conclusions form? Whether immediacy improves understanding or simply satisfies discomfort? These questions are not about astronomy. They are about culture. When attention moves too quickly, it mistakes novelty for importance. When it slows, it begins to notice context. Proportion returns. The object becomes one data point among many rather than a symbol bearing excessive weight. This shift does not require withdrawal from the world. It requires calibration. Calibration is quiet work. It does not announce itself. It happens internally as expectations adjust. The mind learns to tolerate open-endedness, to let some questions remain unanswered without converting them into threats or prophecies. This tolerance is a form of resilience rarely discussed. 3i Atlas offered a chance to practice it. For those willing to pause, the moment became less about anticipation and more about observation, less about outcome and more about process. In that sense, the object fulfilled a role far removed from its physical nature. As this narrative continues toward its closing arc, the emphasis shifts once more, away from the mechanics of attention and toward what remains when attention relaxes, what is left when the impulse to interpret subsides and the observer is allowed to exist without expectation. In that space, something enduring begins to surface, not a conclusion, but a perspective, one that does not depend on objects arriving or passing, but on the steady presence of awareness itself, grounded beneath a sky that continues on, unchanged, unconcerned, and quietly sufficient. That quiet sufficiency of the sky has always been available, though rarely noticed for long. It does not demand interpretation, and it does not resist it. It simply exists, expansive enough to hold every projection placed upon it and indifferent enough to remain unchanged by them. When attention relaxes, this indifference no longer feels cold. It feels stabilizing. In moments when expectation fades, something subtle occurs. The need to extract meaning loosens, and perception becomes less goal-driven. The observer is no longer scanning for signs or outcomes, but simply registering presence. This shift is easy to overlook because it produces no immediate insight. It offers no revelation that can be summarized or shared. Its value lies in the absence of urgency. 3i Atlas moved through awareness quickly enough that this state was only briefly accessible. But for some, that brief access was enough to notice the difference, to feel how attention behaves when it is not pulled forward by anticipation or backward by memory, to recognize that awareness itself can be steady even when information is incomplete. This steadiness challenges a deeply held assumption that understanding must always culminate in explanation. In reality, some forms of understanding end in proportion. They restore scale rather than resolve questions. They remind us where we stand relative to what we observe. From that position, the universe appears neither hostile nor instructive. It appears vast, patterned, and largely unconcerned with human interpretation. This is not a diminishing realization. It is a grounding one. It places human meaning-making within a larger context without invalidating it. The discomfort that often accompanies this realization comes from expectation. We are accustomed to thinking of significance as something assigned from outside, a sign, a message, a turning point. When none appears, the moment can feel empty. But emptiness, in this sense, is simply openness, space without narrative pressure. Cultures that learned to live with this openness tended to encode it quietly, not through dramatic myths, but through practices of patience, watching seasons, tracking stars without insisting they speak, allowing repetition to teach without climax. These practices cultivated endurance rather than prediction. Modern life rarely supports this pace. Attention is fragmented. Moments are framed as decisive by default, yet the capacity for slower perception has not been lost. It remains available whenever urgency loosens its hold. Moments like 3i Atlas briefly create that opening, even if most of the response rushes past it. What matters is not how many noticed, but that noticing was possible at all. It suggests that beneath the layers of interpretation, the observer can still settle into proportion, that the impulse to assign destiny is not absolute, that attention can return to balance. As this reflection moves forward, it carries this balance with it, not as an instruction, but as a tone, a way of standing in relation to events without inflating them or dismissing them, a posture of calm observation that neither seeks meaning aggressively nor rejects it entirely. In that posture, the story of 3i Atlas becomes complete without needing closure. It was a moment of focus, followed by release, a brief convergence of curiosity, followed by quiet dispersal, and in that dispersal, the observer remains, steady beneath the same sky sky, now seen with slightly softened eyes. Those softened eyes do not see less. They see differently. Detail remains, but urgency recedes. The world does not lose its capacity to surprise. It simply stops demanding immediate interpretation. This shift is subtle enough to feel almost imaginary, yet it changes the texture of experience in ways that linger long after the moment has passed. With 3-Eye Atlas now receding into memory, what remains is not information, but orientation, a quiet recalibration of how moments are weighed, the realization that significance is not inherent in rarity alone, and that unfamiliarity does not automatically imply consequence. These are not conclusions drawn from data. They are understandings drawn from attention itself. Every culture develops rituals to manage this balance, ways of marking events without overstating them, ways of honoring uncertainty without surrendering to it. In modern contexts, these rituals are less formal, but they still exist. Pauses in conversation, moments of silence after news fades, the decision to stop following an update and return to the ordinary rhythm of life. Such gestures may seem insignificant, but they shape collective psychology. They determine whether uncertainty escalates or settles, whether attention tightens or relaxes. 3-Eye Atlas passed through a culture still learning how to pause, still negotiating the boundary between awareness and alarm. What made this moment different was not the object's properties, but the opportunity it offered, a chance to notice how easily anticipation forms, how quickly language fills gaps, how rapidly speculation becomes identity. These observations do not require correction or judgment. They require recognition. Recognition brings with it a gentler relationship to the unknown. Instead of treating uncertainty as a problem to be solved, it can be treated as a condition to be lived with. This does not diminish preparedness or curiosity. It simply removes the demand for narrative closure. When this demand relaxes, the sky regains its depth. It becomes less of a screen and more of a context, less of a message board and more of a reminder of scale. Human concerns do not disappear in this view. They are placed within a larger frame, where urgency feels less absolute. 3-Eye Atlas did not offer this frame intentionally. It offered it incidentally, by refusing to become more than it was. By passing without consequence, it allowed the reaction itself to stand out. The contrast between anticipation and outcome revealed the mechanism of attention more clearly than any dramatic event could have. This clarity is easy to miss because it is quiet. It does not announce itself as insight. It feels more like a settling, a sense that something has returned to its proper place. The sky above, the observer below, attention moving between them without strain. As the narrative continues, this settling becomes the foundation. From here, reflection no longer circles the object. It begins to look outward again, toward the long continuity of human attention across generations, toward the repeating pattern of looking up, wondering, interpreting, and eventually letting go. In that letting go, there is no loss, only space. Space for curiosity without fear. Space for wonder without urgency, space to stand beneath an unchanged sky and feel neither warned nor promised, but simply present, aware, and quietly enough. That quiet presence is not an ending. It is a return to a state that existed before the object entered awareness and will persist long after it fades from memory. This return often goes unnoticed because it lacks drama. There is no signal marking the moment attention settles back into equilibrium. It simply happens gradually as interest dissolves into context. In this way, moments like 3-Eye Atlas become almost invisible in hindsight. They do not leave monuments. They do not divide eras, yet they contribute something subtle to the ongoing formation of perspective. Each time attention rises and falls without consequence, the mind gains a little more tolerance for uncertainty, a little more familiarity with a feeling of not knowing. This familiarity matters. It determines whether future moments are met with openness or tension, whether curiosity expands calmly or contracts into urgency. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate. They shape cultural temperament in ways that are difficult to measure but easy to feel. They The history of human attention is not a sequence of revelations. It is a rhythm. Attention gathers. Meaning is projected. Expectation peaks. And then, slowly, the moment releases its hold. What remains is not the object, but the trace of how it was held, whether tightly or gently, whether with fear or with patience. Most historical narratives focus on the peaks, the catastrophes, the discoveries, the moments that force change. But the quieter moments are just as formative. They train the capacity to remain steady when nothing happens. They teach restraint. They normalize the idea that the universe does not always respond to human focus. 3I Atlas belongs to this quieter lineage. It was not a turning point, but a reinforcement of the idea that not every anomaly carries consequence, that awareness does not require drama to be meaningful. That observation alone can be sufficient. This perspective does not diminish the value of attention. It refines it. Attention becomes less about anticipation and more about relationship, a way of staying oriented without insisting on outcome, a way of engaging with the unknown without demanding that it resolve itself on human terms. In this relationship, the sky is no longer a source of instruction. It is a companion to reflection, a constant presence against which human concerns move and change. The stability of that presence offers a counterbalance to internal fluctuation. It reminds the observer that not everything urgent is important, and not everything important announces itself loudly. As this final chapter continues its slow arc toward closure, the emphasis remains on this balance, on the capacity to hold curiosity without anxiety, to notice patterns without becoming trapped by them, to allow meaning to emerge organically rather than forcing it into existence. The story of 3I Atlas does not resolve into a message. It resolves into a posture, a way of standing beneath events as they pass, aware of the mind's tendency to amplify and capable of letting go when amplification is no longer needed. In that posture, attention rests lightly. The sky remains unchanged, and the observer, no longer searching for signals, begins to recognize that the most enduring continuity is not written above, but practiced quietly within. That quiet practice within is rarely acknowledged, yet it shapes the way history is experienced more than any single event. It is the difference between living inside every moment as if it were decisive and living alongside moments as they pass, noting their texture without being consumed by them. This distinction does not emerge naturally. It is learned slowly through repetition, through exposure to uncertainty that resolves into nothing dramatic. 3I Atlas offered one such exposure. It created a brief swell of attention, then withdrew without altering the landscape. For some, this withdrawal felt anticlimactic. For others, it felt reassuring. Both responses are natural. They reveal how deeply expectation influences emotional tone. When expectation is high, silence feels like loss. When expectation is light, silence feels like balance. This difference explains why the same moment can feel unsettling to one observer and calming to another. The object does not change. The posture toward it does. Attention, shaped by prior experience, determines whether uncertainty is interpreted as threat or as space. Modern culture often trains attention toward escalation. Headlines reward urgency. Language gravitates toward extremes. The ordinary is easily overlooked unless it can be framed as exceptional. Within this environment, restraint can feel unnatural, even irresponsible. Yet restraint is not withdrawal. It is discernment, the ability to recognize when intensity exceeds relevance. The moment around 3I Atlas briefly tested this capacity. Some leaned into amplification, others stepped back. Neither choice was permanent, but the contrast revealed something important. That attention is not a fixed trait. It is a skill that can be exercised, neglected, or refined. Refinement does not mean indifference. It means proportion, knowing when to lean forward and when to remain still. Knowing that curiosity does not always require resolution, that some questions are valuable precisely because they remain open. In earlier eras, this understanding was often encoded in silence. Elders knew when not to speak. Stories were withheld until they matured. Meaning was allowed to form over time rather than being declared immediately. This pacing gave attention room to breathe. Today, the opportunity for such pacing is rare but not gone. It appears in moments when expectation rises and nothing follows, when anticipation meets neutrality, when the universe offers no response to human focus. These moments can feel empty or instructive, depending on how they are received. 3i Atlas became instructive by remaining neutral, by offering no reinforcement to the stories projected onto it. In doing so, it allowed attention to reveal itself, to show how quickly it moves, how strongly it clings, and how quietly it can release. This release is not forgetting, it is integration. The moment is absorbed into experience without needing to be preserved as significance. It becomes part of a larger pattern of observation, one among many that teach the same lesson through absence. As this reflection continues, the narrative draws closer to its quiet conclusion, not by narrowing focus, but by widening it, by placing this single moment within the vast continuum of moments that came before and will come after, all of them observed, most of them unresolved, none of them requiring interpretation to exist. In that widening view, the object dissolves almost completely. What remains is the observer, standing within time rather than waiting for it to announce itself. And in that stance, a deeper calm begins to take shape, not because the future is known, but because not knowing no longer feels like a problem to be solved. That deeper calm does not erase curiosity. It steadies it. Curiosity no longer rushes ahead of experience or drags the past forward for explanation. It becomes a sustained openness, capable of holding uncertainty without urgency. This form of curiosity is quieter, but more durable. It does not exhaust itself on every anomaly. Moments like 3i Atlas help cultivate this durability precisely because they do not resolve into events. They ask nothing of the observer beyond attention. When nothing follows, the mind is invited to notice its own response, whether it tightens or relaxes, whether it insists on meaning or allows space. This invitation is rarely recognized because it does not announce itself. There is no clear threshold where interpretation should stop and observation should begin. The transition is internal, marked only by a subtle shift in tone, a sense that the moment has passed, and that holding on to it adds no clarity. Letting go is not always comfortable. It can feel like missing something important, but over time, it becomes apparent that what is missed is not information, but tension. The tension of waiting for confirmation that never arrives. Releasing that tension restores balance. The human tendency to anchor significance to the sky has always been tied to this tension. When the world below feels unstable, the sky appears fixed. When meaning feels fragile, distance feels authoritative. Looking upward becomes a way of outsourcing certainty. 3i Atlas briefly occupied that role, not because it deserved it, but because the need was present. Recognizing this need does not diminish human depth, it reveals it. The desire for external reassurance is part of how meaning has always been negotiated, but reassurance does not always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from recognizing the pattern itself. The pattern is simple. Attention rises, expectation forms, meaning is projected, and eventually reality remains unchanged. Each cycle offers the same opportunity, to escalate or to soften, to cling or to release, to treat the moment as decisive or as passing. With practice, the release becomes easier, not because moments lose importance, but because importance is no longer measured by intensity alone. The absence of outcome no longer feels like failure. It feels like completion. 3i Atlas completed itself by passing through attention without leaving a mark on the world. That is not insignificance. It is a reminder that presence does not require consequence. That observation can be its own form of participation. As this narrative continues toward its final movement, the focus shifts from individual moments to collective memory. How countless small cycles of attention shape the long arc of human perception. How each generation rehearses the same pattern, refining it slightly, sometimes learning restraint, sometimes repeating urgency. The sky remains constant through all of it. Objects come and go. Names change. Stories rise and fade. What persists is the act of looking, the habit of wondering, and the capacity to return to calm once wondering has run its course. In that return, the series finds its quiet closure, not in revelation, but in recognition. The recognition that the most enduring lesson of 3i Atlas was never about the object itself, but about how gently attention can be held when nothing asks it to stay. That gentle holding of attention is not passive. It is active restraint, a conscious choice to remain present without insisting on outcome. This choice rarely feels dramatic, yet it defines the difference between anxiety and awareness. When attention is allowed to rest without clinging, experience unfolds with less friction. Across history, moments that failed to deliver prophecy or catastrophe were often forgotten, yet they quietly trained societies in proportion. They reminded observers that the world does not always pivot when it is watched, that most of reality continues regardless of anticipation. These reminders, though subtle, are essential. Without them, every anomaly would feel like a threat, every deviation a warning. 3i Atlas played this quiet role. It offered no narrative resolution, no confirmation of fear, no fulfillment of expectation. In doing so, it demonstrated something rarely highlighted, that nothing happening is also information. That neutrality can be instructive. That calm can follow curiosity without diminishing it. This understanding shifts how future moments are met. The next unfamiliar signal will still draw attention, but the memory of this pause will temper reaction, not eliminate it, but soften its edges. Experience accumulates not only through events, but through non-events, through moments where anticipation dissolves into ordinary time. Ordinary time is often undervalued. It lacks the sharp contours that make stories memorable. Yet it is where most life unfolds. It is where systems stabilize, where patterns repeat, where continuity is maintained. The sky, unchanged, belongs to this domain. It provides a steady reference against which human fluctuation is measured. By briefly standing out and then receding, 3i Atlas rejoined this continuity. It returned to being one object among many, one movement among countless others. The significance it carried was never intrinsic. It was borrowed from attention, and attention eventually moved on. What remains is not disappointment, but orientation, a sense of where meaning actually resides, not in the object, but in the relationship formed with it, not in the outcome, but in the process of watching, wondering, and releasing. This orientation does not demand discipline. It grows naturally with exposure. Each time anticipation is met with neutrality, the mind learns a little more patience. Each time curiosity resolves into calm rather than alarm, resilience strengthens quietly. As this reflection advances, it begins to touch something broader than any single moment. The shared human experience of standing beneath a vast system that neither opposes nor guides us. The realization that meaning is something we bring into that system, not something it owes us. In this light, the absence of message becomes a kind of gift. It frees attention from obligation. It allows wonder to exist without direction. It permits the observer to remain present without feeling watched in return. And so, the story continues not as a sequence of events, but as a posture carried forward, a way of meeting the unknown with steadiness, a way of looking upward without asking for reassurance, a way of returning, again and again, to the quiet understanding that the sky does not need to change for reflection to deepen. That quiet understanding deepens not through accumulation, but through repetition. Each time attention rises and falls without consequence, the pattern becomes more familiar. Familiarity softens reaction. What once felt charged begins to feel spacious. The unknown remains, but it no longer demands urgency. This is how perspective evolves, not through singular revelations, but through subtle recalibrations over time. The human relationship with the sky has always followed this rhythm. Periods of intense focus are followed by long stretches of indifference. Neither state is permanent. Both are necessary. Three-eye Atlas entered during a moment primed for focus. Systems felt strained. Certainty felt provisional. The collective mind was already scanning for meaning. The object did not create this state. It intersected with it. That intersection amplified response, but it also made the pattern more visible. Visibility changes how patterns are held. When reactions can be observed as they unfold, they lose some of their power. The observer becomes aware not only of the object, but of the movement of attention itself. This awareness introduces choice where once there was only reflex. Choice does not require suppression. It requires space. Space between stimulus and response. Space where curiosity can breathe without rushing toward conclusion. This space is fragile, but it can be protected. Moments like Three-Eye Atlas create it briefly, precisely because they offer no resolution to rush toward. Within that space, something essential becomes clear. Meaning is not discovered. It is negotiated. It emerges through interaction between perception, memory, and expectation. When one of these dominates, balance is lost. When they are allowed to coexist, understanding becomes more resilient. The persistence of ancient narratives around modern moments is evidence of this negotiation. They are not relics resurfacing unchanged. They are tools, reused and reshaped to meet present uncertainty. Their endurance speaks not to hidden knowledge, but to enduring psychological needs. Three-Eye Atlas did not activate these needs uniquely. It simply provided a neutral surface onto which they could be projected. When the surface moved on, the projections dissolved, leaving behind the mechanism itself, briefly exposed. This exposure is valuable because it does not demand belief. It invites observation. It allows individuals to notice how easily meaning accelerates when context is unstable, how quickly attention escalates when silence feels uncomfortable. As this narrative continues, it moves closer to its quiet conclusion by stepping back even further, away from this specific moment, away from this generation, and toward the long continuity of human attention across time. The countless times people have looked up, expected something to happen, and then returned to ordinary life when it did not. In those returns, history is shaped quietly, not by what occurred, but by how people learned to live with what did not, by how often anticipation gave way to acceptance, by how frequently the unknown was allowed to remain unknown without becoming a threat. That allowance is not passive, it is practiced. And with each practice, the observer grows more capable of standing beneath an unchanged sky without needing it to confirm or deny anything at all. That capacity to stand without needing confirmation is rare, yet it has always been present beneath the surface of human history. It emerges not in moments of triumph or catastrophe, but in the long spaces between them. In those spaces, attention learns restraint. It learns that meaning does not vanish when it is not declared. Throughout time, most nights passed without omens. Most skies remained silent. Most celestial movements went unremarked. And still, human life continued, shaped less by revelation than by rhythm. Seasons returned. Communities endured. Memory accumulated quietly without needing every moment to be extraordinary. Three-Eye Atlas belongs to this quiet majority of moments. Its brief elevation into significance was an exception, not the rule, and its return to obscurity was not a failure of meaning, but a restoration of balance. The universe resumed its vast indifference, and attention slowly followed. What makes this worth reflecting on is not nostalgia, but perspective. In a culture that often equates importance with visibility, invisibility can feel unsettling. Yet invisibility is where continuity lives. It is where patterns repeat without interruption. It is where systems stabilize rather than transform. When attention relaxes into this continuity, anxiety loses its urgency. The mind no longer scans constantly for turning points. It recognizes that most change is gradual, layered, and uneven. That history rarely pivots on single objects or moments, no matter how compelling they seem at the time. This recognition reframes the desire for warnings and signs. It reveals them not as flaws, but as expressions of care, a wish to prepare, a wish to protect what matters. But preparation does not always require prediction. Sometimes it requires steadiness, the ability to remain present without overinterpreting every signal. 3i Atlas offered a chance to practice this steadiness, not because it demanded it, but because it offered nothing else. It refused to escalate. It refused to justify the intensity projected onto it. In doing so, it allowed attention to settle back into proportion. Proportion is an understated virtue. It rarely inspires devotion or debate, yet it governs how societies endure uncertainty. Without proportion, every unknown becomes a crisis. With it, uncertainty becomes a condition that can be lived with. As this final chapter continues, the narrative moves toward its closing reflection, not by narrowing focus further, but by acknowledging what has been constant throughout. The sky has not changed. The objects have come and gone. The stories have risen and faded. What has persisted is the observer, the human capacity to wonder, to project, to release, to look upward for meaning, and eventually to realize that meaning does not always arrive from above. In that realization, something stabilizes. Attention no longer searches for reassurance in distance. It rests where it is, present, grounded, aware of its own movement. And in that awareness, the moment of 3i Atlas finds its proper place, not as a signal from the universe, but as a quiet lesson in how we meet the unknown. That lesson remains even as the details fade. Long after names are forgotten and data is archived, the posture learned during the moment endures quietly. It becomes part of the background orientation through which future uncertainties are filtered, not consciously recalled, but subtly felt. Every generation inherits more than stories. It inherits habits of attention, ways of responding to ambiguity, expectations about how meaning should appear. These inheritances are rarely questioned because they feel natural. Looking to the sky when answers are scarce feels instinctive, not learned, yet it is both. 3i Atlas intersected with this inheritance at a time when collective attention was already stretched thin. Information moved faster than reflection. Signals multiplied without hierarchy. In such conditions, even neutral moments can feel charged. The object became a focal point not because it demanded one, but because attention was searching for somewhere to land. What followed was not unique. It was a modern variation of an ancient rhythm. The difference lay in speed. Reaction preceded digestion. Interpretation outpaced understanding. And yet, the cycle still completed itself. Attention rose, peaked, and eventually released. This completion matters. It shows that even in accelerated environments, the mind retains the capacity to settle. Noise does not have the final word. Curiosity can subside without being extinguished. The system is resilient, even when strained. Resilience, in this sense, is not resistance to change. It is adaptability to uncertainty, the ability to remain coherent without requiring constant resolution. Moments like 3i Atlas test this ability not by threatening stability, but by withholding meaning. Withholding can feel uncomfortable. It exposes how dependent attention has become on stimulation, how easily silence is interpreted as absence rather than space. But over time, exposure to neutral moments recalibrates expectation. It restores tolerance for ambiguity. This tolerance does not lead to disengagement. It leads to depth. When the mind is no longer racing toward conclusions, it notices subtler patterns, the slow movement of cycles, the repetition beneath variation, the continuity that persists even as surface details change. The sky, unchanged, embodies this continuity. It does not respond to attention, yet it anchors perspective. By remaining indifferent, it invites humility. By remaining vast, it restores scale. These qualities are not messages, they are conditions. 3I, Atlas briefly drew focus to these conditions by doing nothing remarkable. In that nothingness, something essential was revealed, not about destiny or danger, but about expectation, about how quickly meaning is demanded and how gently it can be released. As this reflection approaches its final movement, the emphasis shifts fully away from the object. It now rests on the observer alone, the human presence beneath time, carrying memory, anticipation, and awareness forward into moments yet to come. The sky will continue to offer objects, signals, and surprises. Some will matter, most will not. What endures is not the accuracy of prediction, but the quality of attention brought to each moment. Whether it tightens in fear or opens in curiosity, whether it insists on meaning or allows space. In that choice, repeated quietly across countless moments, the deeper story is written, not in the stars, but in the way we learn again and again to look at them. That way of looking, once refined, becomes almost invisible to the one practicing it. It does not announce itself as wisdom. It feels ordinary, natural, and that is precisely its strength. When attention is no longer constantly pulled toward urgency, it settles into a rhythm that can endure long stretches of uncertainty without strain. This rhythm has always existed alongside humanity's louder moments. Beneath every crisis remembered in history, there were countless days when nothing decisive occurred. People woke, worked, observed the sky without interpreting it, and returned to sleep unchanged. These days rarely enter narrative, yet they are the foundation upon which all narratives rest. 3I Atlas briefly interrupted this quiet continuity, not by force, but by focus. Attention gathered around it, charged it with expectation, and then watched as nothing followed. When the moment released, continuity resumed. The interruption closed without leaving a mark on the larger flow of time. This return is not trivial. It demonstrates something essential about human perception. That attention can be captured, but it can also be returned. That meaning can be projected, but it does not have to be maintained once it no longer serves understanding. This capacity to release is as important as the capacity to wonder. Many cultures once understood this implicitly. They allowed signs to pass without consequence. They recognized that not every anomaly required response. The modern impulse to interpret everything immediately is not inevitable. It is contextual, and context can change. The experience surrounding 3I Atlas offered a brief opportunity to feel that change, to notice the difference between constant engagement and selective attention, to sense how much energy is conserved when the mind does not treat every unknown as a turning point. This conservation is not withdrawal. It is sustainability. Attention, like any resource, can be depleted by overuse. When it is reserved for moments that truly require it, perception sharpens, judgment improves, curiosity becomes more precise rather than more frantic. As this chapter reaches the threshold between analysis and reflection, the shift is subtle but deliberate. The focus moves away from explaining the pattern and toward inhabiting it, allowing the insight to settle without extracting conclusions from it. There is no final lesson to carry forward, no directive to remember, only a sense of proportion restored, a recognition that most moments pass without altering the course of history, and that this is not a flaw in reality, but its stabilizing feature. The sky remains unchanged above it all. Objects continue to move, indifferent to attention. Human awareness continues to rise and fall in response. Between these movements lies a quiet equilibrium. always available, rarely emphasized. Standing there, beneath that equilibrium, the story of Three-Eye Atlas no longer feels like an event that happened. It feels like a pause that revealed something already present, a pause in which attention briefly saw itself, and then gently returned to the world as it was, unchanged, sufficient, and still unfolding. That unfolding continues whether it is observed or not. Time does not pause for attention, and meaning does not wait for acknowledgement. This realization marks a subtle transition in the reflection, a movement from observing the pattern to understanding its place within a much longer continuity. What appeared as a modern moment begins to resemble something far older. Across civilizations, periods of heightened awareness have often followed the same arc. An unexpected sign appears, attention concentrates, interpretation accelerates, and then, slowly, life resumes its prior rhythm. The sign fades into record or myth, while the structure of response remains ready for the next interruption. This is not repetition by accident. It is repetition by design. Human cognition evolved in cycles. Alertness rises when the environment changes, then falls when stability returns. Over time, this rhythm became embedded not only in biology, but in culture. Stories, rituals, and symbols formed around it, preserving the emotional memory of uncertainty even when the original stimulus was gone. Three-Eye Atlas intersected with this deep structure. It was not large enough to disrupt the physical world, but it was sufficient to activate an ancient sequence. Attention leaned forward. Memory reached backward. Meaning assembled itself quickly, borrowing language from older frameworks to make sense of a present ambiguity. This borrowing is often misunderstood as nostalgia or regression. In truth, it is continuity. The past remains available because it has been useful, not as a record of facts, but as a reservoir of symbolic responses to uncertainty. When modern explanation feels incomplete, older narratives step in to fill the emotional gap. Yet this does not mean the past holds answers the present lacks. It means the human response to uncertainty has changed less than the conditions surrounding it. The tools are newer. The scale is larger. The core experience is familiar. What distinguishes this moment from earlier ones is not the object itself, but the awareness that followed. The recognition that the cycle had repeated again, almost perfectly, without delivering the outcome it seemed to promise. That recognition creates distance. Distance allows reflection. Reflection does not break the cycle, but it softens it. Each time the pattern is seen clearly, it loses a little of its urgency. The mind begins to trust continuity more than disruption. It learns that most moments resolve not through climax, but through quiet persistence. As this final chapter moves deeper into its closing act, the narrative widens beyond the present entirely. It begins to consider the long inheritance of attention itself, how countless generations stood beneath unfamiliar skies, felt the same tension, and then returned to ordinary life when nothing decisive occurred. In that return, something important was preserved. Not a prophecy fulfilled, but a capacity maintained, the ability to live without constant revelation, to find meaning in endurance rather than event. Three-Eye Atlas, in this light, becomes part of a lineage of moments that did not change the world, but subtly shaped how the world was perceived. A reminder that the most enduring patterns are not those written into the sky, but those carried quietly within human awareness, waiting to be activated, observed, and gently released once more. That gentle release is where the cycle completes itself, not with certainty and not with closure, but with a return to proportion. The mind steps back from the edge of expectation and settles again into the steady movement of time. What once felt charged becomes contextual. What felt unresolved no longer asks to be resolved. This return has always been part of human survival. Without it, attention would remain locked in alertness, unable to rest. Ancient communities depended on the ability to stand down after watching the horizon, after reading the sky, after preparing for change that never arrived. Life required the capacity to wait, and then to continue. In modern settings, this capacity is tested differently. Signals are constant. The horizon is crowded with information. The sense of potential disruption rarely fully dissolves. In such conditions, moments like Three-Eye Atlas stand out not because they threaten stability, but because they reveal how rarely attention is allowed to fully release. The object passed, data settled, and yet, for a time, attention lingered, searching for something more. This lingering was not about the sky. It was about habit, about how unfamiliar it has become to let a moment end without extracting a conclusion from it. Seeing this habit clearly creates an opening, not to reject curiosity, but to refine it. Curiosity that knows when to rest becomes more discerning. It stops chasing every possibility and begins to recognize which questions matter and which ones can remain open without consequence. This refinement is not intellectual, it is experiential. It comes from living through cycles that do not culminate in events, from feeling anticipation rise and then dissolve harmlessly. Each time this happens, the nervous system learns that uncertainty does not always escalate, that the unknown can remain unknown without harm. Three-Eye Atlas offered such a learning moment on a collective scale. It allowed many to feel the arc of expectation without the shock of outcome. For some, this felt disappointing. For others, it felt grounding. Both responses are part of the same adjustment process. Over time, these adjustments shape how societies relate to the future. When every anomaly is treated as decisive, fear dominates imagination. When anomalies are allowed to pass, imagination gains space. It becomes possible to think long-term, to value continuity over drama. As this reflection moves closer to its final resolution, the emphasis continues to drift away from the object entirely. The sky becomes background again. The name loses weight. What remains is the posture learned during the pause, the ability to remain attentive without being consumed. In this posture, uncertainty is no longer framed as a void to be filled, but as a condition that accompanies existence itself, something neither threatening nor instructive, simply present. And in learning to live with it, the observer discovers a quieter form of stability, one not dependent on answers arriving from above, but on the steady rhythm of attention returning, again and again, to the world as it is. That steady rhythm, once rediscovered, does not need to be defended. It does not argue with urgency or compete with speculation. It simply persists, offering an alternative pace beneath the surface of constant interpretation. When attention settles into this rhythm, the world feels less like a sequence of tests and more like a field of ongoing presence. This is where reflection begins to outgrow analysis. The need to explain the pattern gives way to the experience of inhabiting it. Understanding no longer arrives as a thought, but as a tone, a quiet confidence that not every moment is fragile and not every unknown is a precursor to loss. Throughout history, societies that endured longest were often those that mastered this tone. They knew when to watch closely and when to return to ordinary life. They did not treat every deviation as a prophecy. They understood that continuity required rest as much as vigilance. Three-Eye Atlas passed through a culture still relearning this balance. The reaction it generated was not wrong, but it was revealing. It showed how alertness has become the default setting, how rarely attention is permitted to disengage fully. When nothing followed, the discomfort was not with the object, but with the absence of direction. Direction feels reassuring because it implies control. Even a negative outcome can feel preferable to ambiguity, but life has never offered such clarity consistently. Most of existence unfolds without instruction, without markers, without explanation. Learning to live within that openness is not resignation, it is resilience. The quiet lesson of this moment is not that meaning is an illusion, but that it does not always need to be foregrounded. Meaning can remain implicit, woven into the fabric of experience rather than extracted from it. This kind of meaning is stable. It does not depend on validation. As attention relaxes, perception widens. Small details regain significance. The familiar returns with depth. The world feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a space to inhabit. This shift does not diminish curiosity. It gives it room to breathe. 3i Atlas now sits fully within this wider frame. It is no longer a focal point. It is one instance among many where anticipation rose and fell without consequence. Its value lies not in what it was, but in what it allowed to be noticed during its passage. As this final chapter moves closer to its closing reflection, the narrative no longer circles the object at all. It remains with the observer, with the human capacity to oscillate between vigilance and rest, between meaning-making and simple presence. In acknowledging this oscillation, something resolves quietly, not a question, but a tension, the tension of expecting every moment to carry significance. When that expectation softens, attention finds its natural equilibrium. And in that equilibrium, the sky resumes its role not as a source of answers, but as a constant, a reminder that while moments come and go, the deeper continuity remains untouched, steady enough to hold both our questions and our silence, without requiring either to be resolved. That deeper continuity is easy to overlook because it does not announce itself. It has no beginning and no clear end. It is the quiet background against which all moments appear dramatic, meaningful, or unsettling. When attention finally rests there, the urge to elevate each event begins to soften. This is not because events lose importance, but because importance is no longer measured by intensity alone. A moment does not need to feel decisive to be real. It does not need to alter the course of history to be fully experienced. Presence itself becomes sufficient. 3i Atlas has now fully receded into this background. Its name no longer carries charge. Its passage no longer invites interpretation. What remains is the trace of how attention behaved while it was present. That trace is subtle, but it influences how future moments are met. This influence is cumulative. Each time anticipation dissolves without consequence, the mind learns that stability does not depend on prediction, that life can continue without explanation. Over time, this learning reshapes expectation. The future feels less like a cliff edge and more like an open horizon. An open horizon does not promise safety or danger. It offers possibility without insistence. This is difficult to tolerate in a culture accustomed to constant signals, yet it is the condition in which most human life has always unfolded. Long stretches of time where nothing announces itself, and yet everything continues. Ancient observers understood this intuitively. They watched the sky not only for signs, but for reassurance that order persisted. The regular return of stars, the slow movement of planets, the predictability of cycles. These patterns mattered not because they warned of change, but because they affirmed continuity. Modern observers inherit this same need, even if it is expressed differently. When systems feel unstable, attention looks upward. When answers are scarce, distance feels authoritative. But when the sky offers no message, it also offers something else: silence. Silence is not absence, it is space. Space in which meaning is not imposed, but allowed to form organically or not at all. Living comfortably with this space is a skill rarely taught, yet deeply stabilizing. 3i Atlas created such a space briefly by refusing to become more than it was. In that refusal, it allowed the mind to experience the end of anticipation without the shock of consequence. It showed that the return to ordinary time can be gentle. This gentleness matters. It changes how endings are perceived, not as losses, but as completions, not as missed revelations, but as natural closures. The moment did not fail to become something. It succeeded in remaining what it was. As this reflection continues toward its final act, the emphasis rests fully on this success, the success of a moment that passed without demanding transformation, the success of attention that eventually released. In recognizing this, something quiet settles. The need to watch the sky for reassurance loosens. Curiosity remains, but it is no longer burdened by expectation. And in that lighter state, awareness finds itself at home in the present, grounded, attentive, and no longer waiting for the universe to explain itself. That sense of being at home in the present is not dramatic. It does not arrive as relief or revelation. It feels ordinary, almost unnoticed, which is why it is so often overlooked. Yet this ordinariness is precisely what allows it to endure. When attention no longer strains toward what might happen, it settles into what is already here. This settling changes how time is felt. The future no longer presses forward as a question demanding resolution. The past no longer pulls backward for explanation. Both remain available, but neither dominates. Experience regains its depth, not through intensity, but through steadiness. 3-Eye Atlas has now fully merged into this steadiness. It exists only as a reference point, a quiet reminder of how attention once gathered and then dispersed. Its meaning was never fixed. It was shaped moment by the way it was held, and once released, it left behind no obligation to remember it in any particular way. This reveals something essential about how significance actually works. It is not stored in objects or events. It is stored in relationship. The same object can be insignificant or profound depending on how it is encountered. When the encounter ends, the significance dissolves naturally unless it is artificially preserved. Modern culture often resists this dissolution. It clings to moments, archives them, replays them, searching for something that might have been missed. But most moments do not contain hidden layers. They contain only what was experienced at the time. Learning to let that be enough is a form of quiet maturity. The sky teaches this lesson repeatedly. Countless objects pass through awareness without leaving a mark. Their value lies not in what they announce, but in how calmly they are allowed to pass. When attention does not demand meaning, movement itself becomes instructive. This does not diminish awe. It refines it. Awe no longer depends on rarity or drama. It emerges from scale, continuity, and the recognition of one's place within something vast and ongoing. The universe feels less like a stage for events and more like a context for existence. 3-Eye Atlas briefly drew attention to this context by standing out and then disappearing. Its disappearance was not an ending. It was a return to the ordinary sky that had always been there, holding countless movements that never entered human awareness at all. In that return, something important was restored. The balance between watching and living, between noticing and participating. Attention no longer hovered in anticipation. It rejoined the flow of everyday experience. As this final chapter continues, it moves ever closer to its quiet conclusion, not by introducing new ideas, but by allowing the existing ones to settle fully, by letting the reflection complete itself without forcing insight. What remains now is not a story about an object, but a state of mind shaped by observing its passage, a calm that does not depend on certainty, a curiosity that does not rush, and a recognition that the most meaningful shifts often occur not when something happens, but when nothing needs to happen at all. That recognition settles slowly, like sediment returning to the bottom after the water has been stirred. It does not announce itself as clarity. It feels more like familiarity, a sense that something has returned to its proper place, even if nothing outward has changed. When anticipation dissolves without consequence, attention regains its natural rhythm. It stops scanning for signals and begins to register continuity again. The days resume their ordinary texture. The sky becomes background, and yet the experience subtly reshapes how future moments are approached. This is how learning often occurs outside of instruction, not through explanation, but through exposure. The mind encounters uncertainty, holds it for a time, and then watches it pass harmlessly. Each time this happens, trust deepens. Not trust in prediction, but trust in continuity. 3-Eye Atlas offered exactly this kind of exposure. It arrived quietly, gathered focus, and then moved on. The absence of consequence was not a void. It was a demonstration that attention can rise and fall without destabilizing the world. That curiosity does not always require resolution. In many ways, this is the most difficult lesson for modern attention to absorb. We are trained to expect payoff, to believe that focus must be rewarded with outcome. When nothing follows, it can feel like a failure of meaning. But this feeling dissolves once the expectation itself is examined. Expectation is not a fact, it is a habit, and habits can change. Each neutral ending loosens the grip of future urgency. Each moment that resolves into ordinariness restores confidence in the underlying stability of experience. This stability does not imply permanence. Change still occurs. Disruption still happens, but they are no longer anticipated everywhere. They are contextualized rather than universalized. Attention becomes selective rather than reactive. The sky plays a quiet role in this recalibration. By remaining largely unchanged, it offers a constant reference point. Its indifference is not neglect, it is scale. It reminds the observer that most movements occur beyond the scope of human concern, and that this is not a threat, but a relief. 3i Atlas briefly disrupted this background, not by force, but by focus. When the focus lifted, the background reclaimed its place. The sky returned to being vast rather than meaningful. And in that return, something in the observer relaxed. This relaxation is not disengagement, it is trust. Trust that not every unknown carries consequence. Trust that meaning does not need to be extracted from every moment. Trust that the absence of message is not an error. As this reflection continues toward its final cadence, the emphasis rests entirely on this trust. A trust learned not through certainty, but through repetition, through living alongside moments that did not demand transformation. In that living, awareness matures quietly. It becomes less attached to anticipation and more grounded in presence. The sky remains overhead, unchanged, expansive, unconcerned, and beneath it, attention learns again how to rest, how to observe, and how to let moments pass without insisting they become something more. That resting of attention marks a subtle turning inward, not toward introspection in the personal sense, but toward an awareness of participation. The observer is no longer standing outside the moment, waiting for it to declare meaning. The observer is inside it, part of the same continuity, moving with time rather than watching it approach. This shift changes the emotional texture of uncertainty. What once felt like a gap begins to feel like space. Space to exist without explanation. Space to experience without narrative pressure. In this space, the future is no longer framed as something that must announce itself. It is allowed to arrive gradually, in fragments, often unnoticed. 3i Atlas now belongs fully to this category of unnoticed arrivals. It came, it drew focus, and it left. Its passage is complete. The work it performed was internal, not external. It did not alter trajectories or forecasts. It altered posture. Posture matters because it shapes response long before thought forms. A tense posture anticipates threat. A relaxed posture allows curiosity. The difference between the two is not knowledge, but relationship. How one stands in relation to the unknown. Human history is full of moments where posture determined outcome more than information. Societies that learned to remain steady through ambiguity endured longer than those that treated every uncertainty as a signal of collapse. Stability was not achieved by eliminating the unknown, but by learning how to live alongside it. This is why the absence of event can be as instructive as the presence of one. When nothing happens, the observer is left alone with expectation. There is no external resolution to lean on. The mind must adjust internally or remain suspended in tension. Over time, adjustment becomes the easier path. 3i Atlas offered this adjustment gently. It did not force reconsideration. It simply waited out attention. When nothing followed, attention had no choice but to soften. In that softening, a lesson was absorbed without being articulated. This lesson is not about complacency. It does not suggest ignoring signals or abandoning curiosity. It suggests proportion, the ability to calibrate response to evidence rather than anticipation, to allow the unknown to remain open without assigning it weight prematurely. As this final chapter approaches its closing blocks, the reflection narrows toward a simple realization that most of what shapes human experience is not what happens, but how what happens is held. Whether moments are gripped tightly or allowed to pass, the sky offers endless opportunities to practice this distinction. Most nights pass without notice. Most movements leave no trace. And yet, the act of looking continues, generation after generation, not because the sky demands it, but because the human mind is drawn to scale, continuity, and silence. 3i, Atlas briefly stood at the intersection of this draw and this discipline. It invited attention and then withdrew, leaving behind not a message, but a memory of restraint. A reminder that awareness does not need to climax to be complete. In that memory, the reflection finds its quiet momentum, moving not toward conclusion, but toward release, toward a final acceptance that the most meaningful response to the unknown is often not interpretation, but presence. That presence, once recognized, does not ask to be maintained with effort. It sustains itself through familiarity. The more often attention is allowed to rest without demand, the more natural that resting becomes. What once required intention becomes habit. The observer no longer waits for permission to relax into the moment. This is where the cycle truly resets, not with an event, but with a return to equilibrium. The anticipation that gathered around 3i Atlas has long since dissipated, yet its imprint remains as a subtle easing of expectation. The sky no longer feels like a question. It feels like a context again. Contexts do not instruct, they hold. They allow movement without commentary. In a context, objects can appear and disappear without being elevated into symbols. This does not diminish their reality. It simply restores proportion. The object becomes part of a larger field rather than a focal point demanding interpretation. Human awareness functions best in this field. When it is not narrowed by urgency, it becomes expansive. It notices relationships rather than threats, patterns rather than predictions, continuity rather than disruption. This mode of perception is not dramatic, but it is deeply stabilizing. 3i Atlas briefly narrowed attention by standing out against the background. When it receded, the background reclaimed its role. The mind, after a moment of adjustment, followed. This following is the quiet success of the moment. Not that something was learned explicitly, but that balance was restored implicitly. Implicit learning is powerful because it reshapes instinct. The next time attention rises, it will do so with a faint memory of release. The next time uncertainty appears, it may not escalate as quickly. These changes are small, but they accumulate over time. This accumulation is how cultures mature, not through eliminating uncertainty, but through learning how often it resolves into nothing extraordinary. Each neutral ending adds weight to continuity. Each absence of outcome strengthens trust in the ordinary flow of experience. The sky continues to participate in this process simply by remaining vast and unchanged. It offers no reassurance and no threat. It does not respond to attention. It absorbs projection and returns nothing in exchange. In doing so, it invites humility without demanding it. 3i Atlas has now fully dissolved into this larger silence. Its name no longer carries tension. Its passage no longer invites revisiting. What endures is not memory of the object, but familiarity with the pause it created. As this narrative moves into its final act, the reflection no longer circles around what was observed. It rests with how observation itself evolved through the moment, how anticipation gave way to patience, how curiosity softened into presence. There is no need to extract more from this. The cycle has completed. Attention rose, hovered, and returned. Nothing was lost, nothing was revealed, and yet something essential was practiced. Standing now beneath the same unchanged sky, the observer does not wait. The moment is not pregnant with meaning. It is simply complete. And in that completeness, the final understanding begins to take shape. not as a thought to be stated, but as a calm that no longer needs the sky to speak. That calm, once it no longer waits for the sky to speak, begins to recognize something quietly profound. Meaning was never absent. It was simply misplaced. It had been projected outward, assigned to distant movement, when it had always been forming inward, shaped by attention itself. This realization does not arrive as correction. It arrives as relief. The effort of interpretation eases. The need to monitor the horizon relaxes. Awareness no longer feels responsible for anticipating what might come next. It becomes free to inhabit the present without scanning it for signs. For much of human history, this inward shift was rarely articulated. It lived beneath myth and ritual, beneath story and symbol. People looked to the sky not only for answers, but because it mirrored their own inner vastness. The silence overhead reflected the silence within, offering space rather than instruction. Modern language often struggles to describe this experience. It prefers explanations to descriptions, conclusions to states. Yet what unfolded around Three-Eye Atlas was not a conclusion. It was a state briefly revealed, a state in which anticipation loosened and attention returned to itself. This return does not negate science or curiosity. It clarifies their roles. Science describes what moves through space. Curiosity asks how we relate to that movement. When these remain distinct, both function more clearly. Confusion arises only when expectation intrudes, when meaning is demanded where none is offered. Three-Eye Atlas offered a clean separation. Its data was sufficient. Its implications were minimal. The rest was projection. Seeing this distinction clearly is not a critique of imagination. It is an invitation to recognize when imagination is working for understanding and when it is compensating for discomfort. Discomfort with uncertainty is not a flaw. It is an inheritance. But inheritances can be held differently over time. They can be examined, softened, and reshaped. Each neutral moment offers an opportunity to do so. As this final act unfolds, the reflection turns toward this reshaping, not as a prescription, but as a possibility. A way of engaging with the unknown that does not require vigilance to feel meaningful. A way of letting curiosity exist without urgency. In this mode, the sky becomes what it has always been, a presence rather than a message, a context rather than a commentary. It does not reflect human fate. It reflects human scale. Three-Eye Atlas, in passing without consequence, restored this perspective briefly. It reminded attention that not every moment is a threshold, that not every anomaly signals transition. That continuity does not require reassurance. With this understanding, the series begins to loosen its grip. The need to trace patterns fades. The desire to resolve questions quiets. What remains is a simple recognition that the most important thing revealed was not hidden in space, but already present in the way attention moved. And as the narrative continues toward its closing blocks, it carries this recognition forward gently, allowing it to deepen without forcing it into language, trusting that what has been felt no longer needs to be explained to remain true. That trust, once established, does not need reinforcement. It settles into the background of awareness, shaping perception without demanding acknowledgement. The moment no longer feels like something that must be understood. It feels like something that has already done its work. This is often how the most lasting shifts occur, not through insight that announces itself, but through a quiet reorientation that becomes visible only in hindsight. The way attention moves changes slightly. The way uncertainty is met softens. The impulse to search for meaning in distance loosens its hold. Three-Eye Atlas now exists only within this hindsight. Its name has become incidental. Its passage no longer stirs anticipation. What remains is the memory of how the moment felt when expectation faded and nothing replaced it. That absence was not empty. It was spacious. Spaciousness is difficult to value in a culture trained to fill every gap. Silence is often mistaken for absence. Stillness is mistaken for stagnation. Yet both are essential conditions for balance. Without them, attention becomes brittle, easily fractured by the next unfamiliar signal. The sky has always offered this spaciousness. It holds movement without commentary. It allows vast processes to unfold without explanation. When attention aligns with this quality, it becomes less reactive and more resilient. This resilience does not come from certainty. It comes from familiarity with not knowing. Each time anticipation dissolves harmlessly, the mind learns that it can endure uncertainty without losing coherence. Over time, this learning accumulates into confidence. Confidence, in this sense, is not belief in outcomes. It is trust in process. Trust that awareness can adapt, that meaning does not vanish when answers are absent, that presence itself is sufficient to carry experience forward. 3i Atlas quietly reinforced this trust by refusing to become a turning point. It remained a moment, nothing more, and in remaining small, it allowed something larger to be noticed. The way attention expands when it no longer feels compelled to contract around expectation. As this final chapter continues its descent toward closure, the narrative now moves with that expansion. It no longer seeks to analyze or interpret. It simply traces the arc that has already completed itself. The rise of attention, the peak of anticipation, the return to calm. There is no need to mark this arc as significant. Its value lies in repetition, not exception. Countless similar arcs have unfolded before and will unfold again. Each one offers the same quiet opportunity to notice, to soften, and to release. Standing now beneath the unchanged sky, the observer does not feel smaller or larger. Scale has found its balance. The universe remains vast. Human awareness remains intimate. Neither requires explanation to coexist. In this balance, the final movement of the series begins to take shape, not as a conclusion to be stated, but as a presence to be felt. A gentle acknowledgement that what passed through the sky mattered only insofar as it revealed how we stand beneath it. And in that standing, calm, unhurried, and attentive, the story prepares to end, not with emphasis, but with ease. That ease does not erase memory. It reorganizes it. What once felt charged now feels settled, no longer pressing for reinterpretation. The mind retains the outline of the moment without clinging to its intensity. This is how experience becomes integrated rather than archived. Integration is quiet work. It happens when attention no longer circles an event, but allows it to take its place among countless others. The moment loses its sharp edges and becomes part of a larger continuity. In this state, reflection does not replay the past. It rests alongside it. 3i Atlas has reached this state. It no longer stands apart as a point of focus. It has been absorbed into the background of lived experience, where it will likely remain unless summoned again by circumstance. Its role is complete. What lingers is not information, but orientation, a subtle sense of how much weight to give the next unfamiliar signal, a memory of how anticipation once rose and then dissolved without consequence. This memory does not prevent future curiosity. It tempers it. Temperance is rarely celebrated, yet it is one of the most stabilizing qualities a society can cultivate. It allows engagement without escalation, interest without alarm, attention without exhaustion. These qualities are difficult to measure, but they shape collective resilience over time. The sky, unchanged, continues to offer opportunities to practice this temperance. Objects will appear, names will circulate, moments will gather focus. And then, most of them will pass without altering the larger pattern of life. Each passage offers a chance to refine posture rather than prediction. This is the deeper continuity that emerges when reflection matures. Not a continuity of events, but of response. The recognition that how we meet moments matters more than what those moments contain. 3i Atlas served as one such meeting. It arrived without demand and left without instruction. The lesson, if it can be called that, was not delivered. It was observed. As this final chapter moves closer to its end, the narrative no longer carries momentum. It slows naturally, not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying less feels more accurate. The space between thoughts becomes part of the meaning. In that space, the observer stands quietly, no longer waiting for the sky to speak. The universe continues its movement. Human awareness continues its rhythm. Neither interrupts the other. The story, now nearly complete, does not seek to resolve into a message. It allows itself to end as the moment ended, gently, without declaration, leaving behind not an answer, but a steadiness that does not require one. That steadiness does not draw attention to itself. It becomes noticeable only when contrasted with agitation. When expectation flares elsewhere and something inside remains calm, the difference is felt rather than understood. This is how quiet insight endures. It changes reaction before it changes thought. Over time, this change reshapes the way moments are valued. Events no longer need to justify their importance through consequence. They are allowed to exist fully and then pass. The absence of aftermath is no longer interpreted as failure. It is recognized as completion. 3i Atlas reached this completion without ceremony. Its presence did not require preservation. Its absence did not demand explanation. The arc closed naturally, as most arcs do, without announcing itself as an ending. This natural closure is difficult to recognize because modern narratives rarely allow it. Endings are expected to be definitive, instructive, or transformative. When none of these appear, the instinct is to reopen the moment, to search again, to extract something overlooked. Yet not every experience contains a hidden layer. Some experiences are complete exactly as they are. Learning to trust this completeness is part of maturation. It reduces the need to revisit, reinterpret, and rehearse. It frees attention to move forward without residue. This does not mean forgetting. It means integration without attachment. The sky models this constantly. Movements occur without leaving traces visible to the naked eye. Patterns repeat without commentary. Vast processes unfold without acknowledgement. And still, the system remains coherent. When human awareness aligns with this coherence, it becomes less reactive. The next unknown does not automatically feel like a disruption. It feels like another movement within a larger field. Interesting, perhaps, worth noticing, but not necessarily decisive. 3i Atlas offered a glimpse of this alignment by doing nothing extraordinary. In that nothing, attention had room to notice itself settling. The lesson did not arrive through information, but through experience. As this final chapter continues its slow descent, the emphasis rests fully on this experiential understanding. The words are no longer guiding toward insight. They are stepping aside, allowing what has already been felt to remain. There is no urgency now, no need to anticipate what comes next. The reflection has reached a point where continuation would only repeat what has already been integrated. Silence becomes more accurate than explanation. Standing beneath the unchanged sky, the observer feels neither small nor significant, only present. And in that presence, the story no longer needs to continue to feel complete. What remains is not a conclusion, but a calm recognition that the most meaningful moments are often those that end quietly, leaving behind not answers but balance. That balance settles into awareness without needing reinforcement. It becomes part of the internal landscape, shaping perception subtly, almost invisibly. When new moments arise, they are met from this steadier ground, not as interruptions demanding resolution, but as experiences allowed to unfold. This is how continuity sustains itself, not through constant attention, but through the capacity to let attention move freely without becoming trapped. The mind learns when to engage and when to release. Over time, this discernment feels less like effort and more like instinct. 3i Atlas has now fully assumed its place within this instinctive memory. It no longer represents an object or a moment, but a reference point for restraint, a reminder, faint but present, that anticipation can soften without loss, and that nothing essential is threatened when a moment ends without explanation. In many ways, this is the most human response possible: to be curious without being consumed, to notice without assigning destiny, to allow the world to remain larger than our interpretations of it. This posture does not reduce meaning, it protects it from inflation. Inflated meaning collapses under its own weight. It demands outcomes that reality rarely provides. When those outcomes fail to arrive, disillusionment follows. Balanced meaning, by contrast, remains flexible. It adapts to silence. It survives neutrality. The sky, unchanged, continues to teach this lesson simply by being there. Its vastness does not compete with human attention. It absorbs it and remains itself. In doing so, it offers a stable counterpoint to internal fluctuation. Three-Eye Atlas briefly drew attention upward and then released it. That release was not empty. It carried with it a recalibration, a subtle shift away from urgency and toward proportion. This shift may not be consciously remembered, but it influences how future moments are met. As the narrative approaches its final cadence, the movement slows even further, not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying less now feels more truthful. The reflection has completed its arc, and repetition would add weight where lightness is more appropriate. The observer stands quietly within this lightness. The sky does not speak. It does not need to. Awareness rests without expectation. The question that once drove attention has dissolved, not into an answer, but into acceptance. In this acceptance, the series finds its quiet center, a recognition that the most revealing aspect of the moment was never the object itself, but the way it invited attention to gather and then taught it how to let go. That letting go is not an ending imposed from outside. It arises naturally when attention has completed its movement. There is no force involved, no decision to stop caring. Care simply returns to its proper scale. What once felt urgent now feels finished, without effort. This is how awareness closes its own loops. When a moment has been fully experienced, it does not need to be revisited. The mind recognizes completion not through explanation, but through relief. The absence of tension is the signal that nothing remains unresolved. Three-Eye Atlas reached this point quietly. Its passage no longer occupies thought. Its name no longer carries emotional weight. It has become neutral again, just as it was before attention gathered around it. The difference is not in the object, but in the observer. The observer has changed posture, slightly, almost imperceptibly. There is now a familiarity with how easily attention can accelerate and how gently it can return. This familiarity does not prevent future engagement. It refines it. Refinement is rarely visible in the moment. It reveals itself later, when a similar stimulus appears and the reaction feels calmer than expected, when curiosity arises without urgency, when uncertainty no longer demands immediate narrative. These small shifts accumulate. Over time, they shape temperament, not only individually, but collectively. Cultures are formed as much by what they learn to ignore as by what they choose to emphasize. The ability to let moments pass without inflating them is a quiet strength. The sky continues to offer endless opportunities to practice this strength. Most movements overhead will never be named. Most changes will never be noticed. And yet, the system remains coherent, vast, and uninterrupted. Three-Eye Atlas briefly stepped out of this anonymity, not because it was exceptional, but because attention was ready to gather. When attention released, anonymity returned. That return was not a loss. It was restoration. As this reflection moves toward its final blocks, the emphasis rests fully on this restoration, the restoration of proportion, the restoration of calm, the restoration of trust in the ordinary unfolding of time. Nothing needs to be concluded. Nothing needs to be warned against. The moment has already done what it could do. It has passed. What remains is the observer, standing beneath the same sky, no longer waiting for it to announce meaning. The observer is no longer braced for revelation. Attention rests where it belongs, open, steady, and unhurried. And in that unhurried state, the story prepares to close not with certainty, but with a quiet release, allowing silence to complete what reflection has already set gently in place. That silence does not feel empty. It feels earned. It arrives only after attention has moved through anticipation, curiosity, and release. Once it settles, there is no impulse to fill it. The quiet stands on its own, complete, without requiring explanation or reinforcement. In this quiet, the difference between event and experience becomes clear. Events happen in the world. Experiences happen within awareness. 3i Atlas was an event of little consequence, but the experience surrounding it was meaningful because it revealed how awareness behaves when faced with uncertainty. This distinction matters. It clarifies why some moments linger despite leaving no physical trace. The value was never in what occurred externally, but in what shifted internally. When this is understood, disappointment dissolves. Nothing was missing. Nothing failed to happen. The mind often searches for significance in outcomes because outcomes feel measurable. But experience is shaped more by process than result. The rise and fall of attention, the formation and release of expectation, the return to calm. These movements leave a deeper imprint than any conclusion could. 3i Atlas completed this process fully. It did not interrupt life. It did not alter trajectories. It allowed awareness to rehearse a cycle that has been repeated across history. Looking up, expecting meaning, and eventually realizing that meaning does not always arrive from above. This realization does not discourage looking. It changes how looking feels. The sky is no longer approached with tension or anticipation, but with openness. Objects may still draw attention, but they no longer carry the weight of expectation. As the narrative nears its end, there is no need to revisit earlier arguments or observations. They have already settled into coherence. What remains now is simply to acknowledge the completion of the arc. The sky did not change. Its vastness remains untouched by human focus. What shifted was attention. It gathered, projected, softened, and returned. In doing so, it revealed itself. This is why the moment mattered. Not because it pointed to something beyond itself, but because it reflected something already present. The human tendency to seek meaning, and the equally human capacity to let that search rest. Standing beneath the same sky now, the observer does not feel compelled to interpret. The moment has closed. Awareness remains. And in that remaining, calm and unforced, the reflection finds its final momentum, moving gently toward an ending that does not declare itself, but simply allows the quiet to deepen, trusting silence to finish what words no longer need to say. That deepening quiet signals that nothing more needs to be carried forward from the moment itself. The reflection has already settled into the place where language becomes secondary to presence. What was noticed no longer requires framing. It has been absorbed. This absorption is not forgetting. It is completion. The mind recognizes when a cycle has ended and releases it naturally. There is no sense of loss because nothing essential was tied to outcome. The value was in the movement of attention, not in what it arrived at. 3i Atlas now exists only as a faint contour in memory, not a highlight, not a warning. Simply one moment among many that passed through awareness and then returned to anonymity. Its significance lies entirely in what it revealed during its brief stay. That revelation was quiet. Attention, when left without reward or resolution, eventually relaxes. It stops insisting. It returns to balance. This is not resignation. It is trust in continuity. Trust that life does not require constant interpretation to remain meaningful. This trust changes the relationship with uncertainty. The unknown is no longer framed as an absence to be filled, but as a space that does not need filling at all. Curiosity can remain alive without urgency. Awareness can remain open without tension. Throughout this series, attention moved outward, toward objects, patterns, histories, and comparisons. Now, it has returned inward, not as introspection, but as orientation, a recognition of where meaning actually stabilizes, not in distant movement, but in the way perception meets it. The sky remains unchanged. Objects will continue to pass. Some will be noticed. Most will not. This is not indifference. It is proportion. The universe does not revolve around attention, and attention does not need the universe to revolve around it. As this final act approaches its closing blocks, the narrative prepares to release itself fully. There is nothing left to argue, nothing left to reveal, only a state to remain with for a moment longer. In this state, the observer does not look upward expecting confirmation. The observer looks, and that is enough. The act of looking has become complete in itself, and so the reflection slows further, approaching its natural end, not with a conclusion drawn, but with an understanding settled. That what passed through the sky mattered only insofar as it reminded us how gently attention can rest once it no longer waits for meaning to arrive from beyond. That gentle resting of attention marks the beginning of release, not release from curiosity, but from the need to carry the moment any further. The reflection no longer moves forward because it has arrived where it needs to be. What remains is presence, unburdened by expectation. Every generation believes it stands at a turning point. This belief feels convincing because attention is always anchored in the present, where uncertainty feels most immediate. Looking backward, turning points appear obvious. Looking forward, they feel imminent. Yet most lives unfold in the space between these imagined thresholds, shaped more by continuity than by rupture. Three-Eye Atlas briefly occupied that imagined space. For a moment, it felt like it might matter in a decisive way. When it did not, something quieter became visible. The pattern itself, the way attention seeks thresholds even when none exist, the way meaning is anticipated before it is earned. Seeing this pattern does not remove it, it softens it. Awareness introduces choice where instinct once ruled. The next time attention gathers around an unfamiliar moment, there may be just enough space to notice the familiar rise of expectation and to let it rise without tightening around it. This is not detachment. It is intimacy with experience as it is, rather than as it promises to be. The present no longer feels like a waiting room for significance. It feels complete on its own terms. The sky continues its movement, indifferent and vast. It does not confirm fears or validate hopes. It simply remains. In doing so, it offers a steady reference against which human fluctuation can be felt without being overwhelmed by it. Three-Eye Atlas has now fully dissolved into this background. Its moment has passed, not with resolution but with quiet acceptance. Nothing was revealed, nothing was lost. The world continues exactly as it was, and that continuity feels sufficient. As this series moves toward its final words, there is no sense of anticipation left to satisfy. The reflection has completed its arc. Attention has returned home. What remains is a calm recognition that the most important thing about moments like this is not what they announce, but what they allow us to notice about ourselves, how quickly we look outward for answers, and how gently we can return inward when no answer arrives. In that return, something settles. The feeling of standing at the edge of history fades. The need to interpret the sky loosens, and what is left is simply awareness, present, steady, and no longer waiting for anything to begin. That sense of no longer waiting is subtle, but it changes everything. When expectation releases its grip, time no longer feels like a corridor leading toward resolution. It becomes a field in which experience unfolds without pressure. The present stops asking to be justified by what comes next. This is where reflection reaches its most honest form. Not analysis, not interpretation, but recognition. The recognition that much of human tension comes not from events themselves, but from the anticipation layered onto them. When that layer thins, reality feels quieter, but also more complete. The sky has always existed in this completeness. It does not hurry. It does not signal transitions. lens. It does not divide time into chapters. It holds movement without narrative, change without commentary. When attention aligns with this quality, something essential relaxes. Three-Eye Atlas passed through awareness without altering that completeness. The universe did not react, the sky did not respond. Only attention moved, and once it returned, the world remained exactly as it had been, vast and unmarked. This is not indifference. It is scale, and understanding scale is one of the most stabilizing insights available to human awareness. It places urgency in proportion. It softens the edges of fear. It allows wonder to exist without demanding outcome. Every generation eventually encounters moments that reveal this truth, sometimes through loss, sometimes through discovery, sometimes through nothing happening at all. These moments rarely announce themselves as lessons. They feel ordinary, even anticlimactic, but they quietly reframe expectation. Three-Eye Atlas did this by remaining small, by refusing to become a symbol, a warning, or a turning point. In its restraint, it reflected the restraint available within attention itself, the ability to stand down, to stop scanning, to rest. As this final chapter approaches its closing breath, the reflection no longer seeks to hold the listener. It releases them. There is nothing to anticipate beyond this point, no insight waiting just ahead. What has been noticed is already complete. The sky remains. The observer remains. The relationship between them no longer feels strained by meaning. It feels simple. And in that simplicity, the series finds its ending not as a statement, but as a quiet space where nothing more needs to be said and nothing more needs to happen. That quiet space lingers without asking to be filled. It feels less like an ending and more like a pause that does not need to lead anywhere. In this pause, the impulse to summarize fades. The need to extract a final meaning dissolves. What remains is enough. Every reflection eventually reaches this point. The moment when understanding no longer sharpens, but softens. When insight stops accumulating and begins to settle. This is not the loss of clarity. It is the arrival of proportion. Three-Eye Atlas no longer occupies thought at all. Its role has been fulfilled and released. The object has returned to obscurity, as most objects do. The attention it gathered has dispersed, as attention always does. Nothing extraordinary remains, and that is precisely what makes the moment complete. The human tendency to seek finality often overlooks this kind of completion. We expect closure to feel decisive, transformative, or conclusive, but most closure is quiet. It happens when a question no longer presses, not because it was answered, but because it no longer needs to be asked. This is the state reached now. The sky is no longer watched for reassurance. The future is no longer framed as a message waiting to arrive. Awareness rests without anticipation, comfortable with the open horizon ahead. This comfort does not come from certainty. It comes from familiarity with uncertainty, from having lived through moments of heightened attention that resolved into calm, from knowing at a felt level that nothing collapses when meaning does not appear. Generations before have known this feeling, even if they did not name it. After signs faded, after prophecies failed, after skies remained silent, life continued. Work resumed. The world endured. In that endurance, something stable was preserved. The capacity to live without constant revelation, to move forward without waiting for permission from the sky. Standing here now, in the closing quiet of this reflection, there is no sense of loss. Nothing has been taken away. The absence of drama does not feel like absence at all. It feels like balance restored. The story has already ended in every way that matters. The attention has returned. The sky remains unchanged. The observer remains present. Only one final movement remains. Not a conclusion to be delivered, but a letting go that allows silence itself to complete the thought, gently, without emphasis, and without needing anything further to follow. That letting go happens on its own. There is no final gesture required, no statement to seal what has already settled. The reflection simply fades back into the quiet continuity from which it arose. Attention no longer holds the moment. It releases it without resistance. What remains is not a lesson carried forward like an object, but a way of standing that feels natural again. A recognition that meaning does not always arrive from the sky, and that it does not need to. The sky has remained unchanged throughout this entire passage, and in that constancy, something stable has been offered without ever being given. Every generation believes it stands at a turning point, and every generation looks upward, sensing that answers might come from above. This impulse is ancient, human, and enduring. But just as enduring is the quieter realization that follows, when nothing arrives and life continues anyway. 3i Atlas will fade from memory, as countless objects have before it. Names will be replaced, moments will be reclassified, attention will move on to something new, yet the pattern will remain intact, waiting patiently beneath the surface, not written in the stars, not carried by objects, but written in us, in how we respond to uncertainty, in how we project meaning, in how we learn, slowly, to release. The sky did not change, our attention did, and now, even that change no longer asks to be held. There is nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to resolve, only the quiet continuity of being present beneath an unchanged sky, allowing the silence to finish the thought on its own.